The Century of Columbus by James Joseph Walsh. Book 1, Chapter 6, Sculpture in Italy. Columbus's century was destined to see the creation of some of the finest sculpture since the time of the Greeks. Probably in no department of art does this period stand out as so surely surpassing any other period of modern times, or indeed any time except the Periclean, as in its power to furnish great examples of plastic art. Triumphs of sculpture were accomplished in every medium: stone, bronze, terracotta, wood, and the precious metals. The eve of the century saw the making of some very great sculptures, which portended the wonderful development that was to come. It was in 1447 that Ghiberti completed the second pair of doors for the baptistery at Florence, which have been the admiration of the world ever since. After this, it was easy to understand that there was no development of artistic expression in plastic work that might not be expected. All the expectations possible were realized in the succeeding 100 years. Columbus's century was ushered in with as great a triumph in sculpture and by the work of a master as great in his maturity, which came just then, as Fra Angelico was in painting. Fra Angelico, however, had been but little touched by the Renaissance spirit of classicism, while Donatello, the familiar name for Donato di Niccolo di Bettipardi, whom the classic impulse was to carry ahead of all contemporary artists and indeed to make a model and a subject of study for all succeeding students of sculpture, was born even before the close of the 14th century, but like so many of the distinguished artists of the Renaissance period, lived a long life of persistent work and great achievement, and the most important part of that work came after 1450. His greatest triumph, the monument to Gattamelata, was set up in Padua in 1453. There are two equestrian statues that are conceded by all the world to be supreme works of art, and copies of which are to be found in many museums throughout our civilization. One of these is Donatello's Gattamelata, and the other the Colleoni, by Verrocchio, who was a disciple of Donatello. The earlier sculptor had seen some of the equestrian monuments of the Roman times, and had wondered whether he could not imitate them, or at least accomplish the same purpose. Undaunted by the difficulties as men seem ever to have been at this time, he faced not only the problem of making the model that would express his ideas, but of putting it into the bronze form that would make it imperishable. He had to master all the problems of equine anatomy, but above all, he had to make himself familiar with the details of the technique of the founder's art, so as to master the process of casting so large a work absolutely in the round. Practically, he had to discover a great many of these technical points for himself, and he had to invent methods of accomplishing his purpose. To most men at any time, this would have seemed an almost impossible achievement. They would have been discouraged from attempting it. There were many simpler forms of his art that he might practice, and not take on his shoulders all the techniques of the bronze foundry, but Donatello undisturbedly went on his way and accomplished his purpose. There is nothing more interesting, and at the same time nothing more characteristic of this period of discovery and achievement, indeed, it is a worthy prelude to Columbus's century, than the fact that the very first equestrian statue, made in the modern times when all the difficulties, material as well as artistic, were heaped up before the sculptor, is one of the greatest monuments of that kind in the world's history. Only the Colleoni, made a half a century later, surpasses, if indeed that is to be conceded, yet this was the very first attempt. This is not so surprising, however, if one realizes the significance of other work of this time. Within a half a century of the invention of oil painting, some of the greatest masterpieces of that mode came into existence. Within less than half a century of the invention of printing, some of the most beautiful books that have ever been made were printed. There has been a tendency in our time, as a result of much discussion of evolution, to think that such triumphs of achievement come only after a long evolution and as a climax of a prolonged process of development. On the contrary, genius at any time in the world's history takes hold of a mode of expression for the first time and secures a triumph in it that will be the envy and admiration of all succeeding generations. While Donatello's success in this huge equestrian work might be expected to stamp his genius as much more fitted for monumental sculpture than any other mode of his favorite art, there is scarcely any phase of sculpture which he has not illustrated beautifully. The very spirit of youth is caught and fixed in imperishable bronze in his St. George. There is probably no more successful attempt at the artistic rendering of the little poor man of God than Donatello's sculptured expression of him in his statue of St. Francis in the church of St. Anthony of Padua. It was Donatello who, according to M. Muntz, the German authority on the history of sculpture, recovered the child from antiquity and gave it back to art. Some of his baby faces are among the most beautiful ever made, and yet without any of the sickly sentimentality that would make them pall. Their bodies are alive, their draperies cling or float as they touch their wearers, or are caught up by the air. Only his great contemporary, Luca della Robbia, has rivaled him in this regard, and it is doubtful whether even he has excelled him, though the world as a rule knows della Robbia for his baby faces and thinks of Donatello as having accomplished more monumental work. Donatello's Bambino Gesù, infinitely human, and his boyish St. John the Baptist, precociously serious, in the church of the Vanciatoni, Florence, where they are seldom seen unless particularly looked for, are charming examples of Donatello's power of expression in child faces. In Donatello, as in so many of these artists of Columbus's century, the man is almost more interesting than his work. While at Padua doing the Gattamelata, Vasari tells us that his works were held to be miracles, and they were praised so much that finally the master resolved characteristically to return to Florence. He naively remarked one day, "If I stayed here any longer, I should forget all I have ever known through being so much praised. I shall willingly return home, where I get censured continually, for such censure gives occasion for study, and brings as a consequence greater glory." His end was very sad. He, whose hands had accomplished so much, was stricken with paralysis, and yet lived on for years. His pupils, with whom the great master was a favorite, took care of him, and even to the end took his suggestions, worked out his ideas, and brought their work to him for criticism. Galileo, a century later, unable to see after having seen farther into the heavens than any other. Beethoven, unable to hear after having written some of the most divinely beautiful music ever conceived, may be compared to Donatello, with his useless, skillful hands. Even this sad fate did not sour him, however, but only made him tenderer to those who needed help. He had no near relatives and some distant connections, hearing that his end was near, and as Hope Rea tells in his Donatello, to which I am indebted for most of the details of this sketch, reminded him of their existence and begged him to leave them a small property which he possessed near Prato. Quote, "I cannot consent to that, relations mine," he answered, "because I wish, as indeed seems to me to be reasonable, to leave it to the peasant who has labored so long upon it, and not to you who have never done anything in connection with it, and indeed wish for it as some recompense for your visit to me. Go, I give you my blessing." End quote. The epigram with which old Giorgio Vasari ends his all too short appreciation of the great master seems the most fitting close that could be made to any notice of his life. Quote, "Either the spirit of Donatello wrought again in Buonarroti, or the genius of Buonarroti had pre-existence in Donatello." End quote. Among the great artists in the highest sense of that word, and one of the great sculptors of this period, must be reckoned Luca della Robbia, with whose name there are naturally associated the names of others of this family, and particularly Andrea. Luca was chosen as one of the sculptors to execute portions of the decorative work of the Duomo at Florence. He did one of the famous cantorias, the two sculptured marble singing galleries, which are unfortunately no longer in the Duomo itself, but in the museum at the eastern end of the great church. This was finished in 1438, when Luca, whose years run coincident with the century, was 38 years of age. Among the artists from whom the Florentine officials might have chosen for the execution of these singing galleries was also Donatello, who actually modeled the other of the pair, and Ghiberti, since famous for the great doors of the baptistery. It is sufficient to say that when Luca della Robbia's singing gallery was finished, the Florentines realized very well that no mistake had been made in giving him the execution of it, even though he had such great rivals. This is almost the only great work in marble that we have from Luca della Robbia. He was a scientist as well as an artist, and he was very much interested in artistic glazed work. He devoted himself to making this as perfect as possible, and succeeded in adding this as a wonderful new medium to sculpture. Like so many other of the artists, painters, and sculptors of this time, he was originally a goldsmith, but became ambitious of doing higher things than those usually committed to the craftsman. Vasari tells us that he carved all day and drew all night, keeping his feet warm through the long winter evenings by covering them up in a basketful of carpenter shavings. He worked at the glazing of terracotta with the idea at first apparently of preserving his clay models by baking them. Working in this new medium, he brought to the execution of the models for it all his genius as a sculptor and succeeded in accomplishing some of the most beautiful results. He developed the medium so as to secure charming color, creamy white figures that stand out from a cloudy blue background with a glaze that is perfect and joints that are almost invisible. It is only in comparatively recent years that a due meed of appreciation has been accorded to della Robbia's work once more, though his contemporaries valued him at his true worth. But in compensation for the neglect, his pieces are now among the most costly works of art whenever they turn up at public sales. While devoting himself to the new artistic modes, he accepted commissions in both bronze and marble for the embellishment of Florence, and the bronze doors of the sacristy of the Duomo are his, as well as certain reliefs in marble on the campanile. In fact, as Hope Rea says in his Tuscan and Venetian Artists, quote, "The total amount of work produced by him in the middle 20 years of his life shows him to have been one of those strenuous laborers in art, the like of whom have hardly been seen before or since the years of the Renaissance." Luca never married, but he gave every opportunity to his nephew, Andrea della Robbia, who was an apt pupil, but who confined himself practically entirely to the new style invented by his uncle. In spite of what might be expected, the young man, with the advantage of his uncle's training and the possession of his uncle's secrets, did not do better work, though the amount of it that he turned out made the della Robbia terracotta an important part of Florentine art. In his hands and those of his son Giovanni, what had been as pure an art as any form of sculpture came to be merely a decorative craft. Andrea's many beautiful pieces, however, and especially the well-known Bambine, the swaddled infant medallions of the Hospital of the Innocents, have been very popular at all times and have entered into renewed popularity in our day. The great series of incidents of St. Francis's life, executed by Andrea for the Franciscan monastery of La Verna, represents the climax of his artwork. He was thoroughly sympathetic with the early Franciscan traditions, and he expressed the details of them beautifully. One of the greatest of the sculptors of the Renaissance, who must indeed be reckoned among the greatest artists of all times, is Leonardo da Vinci's teacher, Andrea del Verrocchio. He was one of the wonderful Florentine artists whose genius was recognized by Lorenzo the Magnificent, and was given the opportunity to express his artistic conceptions worthily by this liberal patron of the arts and literature. 3 of his great works, the tomb of Piero and Giovanni de' Medici in the Church of San Lorenzo, his David, which is in the National Museum, the Bargello in Florence, and the child holding a dolphin, now in the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio, were all 3 executed for Lorenzo. These are all in bronze, but with the versatility of the men of his time, Verrocchio could express himself in other media just as charmingly. Michel has said of the terracotta Madonna made for the Hospital of Santa Maria Novella that in it supreme distinction of thought is combined with the most scrupulous observation of nature. The famous marble bust of a flower girl is in the Bargello, a silver bas-relief the beheading of John the Baptist, is now in the Cathedral Museum at Florence. His two masterpieces are the Incredulity of St. Thomas and the statue of Colleoni, the celebrated condottiere who had commanded the Venetian troops. Both of these are in bronze. Little as the deep feeling of the scene between Christ and the doubting Thomas might seem apt to lend itself to expression in sculpture, Verrocchio has succeeded in making an extremely beautiful and touching work of art. The divine humanity, urging Thomas, the doubter, to put his hand into his pierced side, is a wonderful realization of one of the most pathetic of incidents. The triumph of Verrocchio's genius, however, is the Colleoni. It is probably the greatest equestrian statue ever made. His contemporaries declared that Leonardo da Vinci's figure of the Duke of Milan on horseback surpassed it. Sometimes doubt is expressed as to whether Donatello's Gattamelata does not rival it. That question must be left for great artists and sculptors to decide, and in the meantime, there is no doubt at all that Verrocchio was one of the greatest sculptors who ever lived. Burckhardt declared that, quote, "We have a right to call this equestrian statue the finest in the world." End quote. Unfortunately, Verrocchio was seized with a chill while casting it and died at the early age of 43, or we might have had some still more wonderful work from him. He is a typical many-sided genius of the Renaissance, though in sculpture particularly only two, perhaps three of his greatest contemporaries ever equaled him. It is even doubtful if they have excelled his Colleoni, yet everything that he ever did was an advance on his previous accomplishment. His disciple, Leopardi, who finished the casting of the Colleoni, is another great sculptor of the time who, in any other period, would be looked upon as a supreme artist. He has shone with reflected glory, besides, for his part in the Colleoni, though it is very doubtful whether any but very small credit is due to him for the completion of this work, which Verrocchio had left in such a state that but little was required to make it what it had been ever since, one of the world's greatest monuments of sculpture. A great sculptor of the Renaissance, whose career presents many other features of interest, however, which have made him famous, is Benvenuto Cellini. He was born in 1500, and like many of the artists and most of the sculptors of the time, began his life work as an apprentice to a goldsmith. After a troubled early manhood in Rome and other Italian cities, during which he executed some medals that are among the best of their kind ever made, and various ornamental pieces in the precious metals, he was for a time at the court of Francis I. Afterwards he worked in Florence, lending his genius to the fortification of this city during the war with Siena. While his career is entirely exceptional among the great artists of the time, it is often taken for a type of the restless, rather unmoral than immoral, character that was supposed to be produced by the paganizing influence of the new learning. The true types of Columbus's century among the artists, however, are such men as Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, deeply intent on their work, anxious only for the opportunity to accomplish high artistic purpose, and without any of that restless unmorality that is at least supposed to have characterized Cellini. It would be much nearer the truth to point to the lives of such men as Fra Angelico or Fra Bartolomeo, happy in their monastery homes, or Correggio, who spent his time so peacefully with the religious of the little town in which he lived, than to appeal to Benvenuto's checkered stormy career as typical of the Renaissance. Cellini's autobiography, as great a work of imaginative art, very probably, as any that he ever executed in plastic materials, has attracted as much attention in literature as his great sculptures have in art. His name, then, has become familiar to many who know nothing about the intimate personal careers of the great artists of the time, and who will in all good faith continue to draw their conclusions as to the character of the men of the Renaissance from Cellini's rather boastful proclamation of his successful vices, though this exactly represents the exception which proves the rule to be the opposite. In spite of his forbidding picture of himself, he had moments of intense religious feeling and highest inspiration. Anyone who has seen his famous Christ in marble in the Escurial will not be likely to think that he was entirely lacking in deep religious feeling. His famous bronze group of Perseus holding the head of Medusa to which deservedly the Florentines have given a distinguished place in front of the old ducal palace at Florence, is one of the masterpieces of modern sculpture. W. M. Rossetti spoke of it in his article in the Encyclopaedia Britannica as a work full of the fire of genius and the grandeur of a terrible beauty, one of the most typical and unforgettable monuments of the Italian Renaissance. His story of the casting of this great monument shows the difficulties under which the sculptors of the time labored, and yet how triumphantly they overcame technical obstacles and made great works of art. While so great as a sculptor in monumental work, Cellini never thought art objects of small size beneath his attention, and like Raphael, willing to make the cartoons for the tapestries of the Sistine Chapel and composing great pictorial scenes as their subjects, so Cellini, with a true Renaissance artistic spirit, modeled beautifully any and every form of work in metal. He modeled flagons, bells, and even rings and jewels, designed coins and medals for the papal mint and for the Medici at Florence. It has been said that everything minted under his direction attained the highest excellence. His work in high relief was as fine as that in bas relief. All over Europe, there are well-authenticated specimens of smaller pieces from his hands, a bell in the Rothschild collection, a gold salt cellar in Vienna, a shield elaborately wrought in Windsor Castle, and even beautifully chased armor, such as he made for Charles IX of Sweden, which may be seen at Stockholm. Of course, for any proper estimation of the Italian sculpture of this period, the work of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo must bulk very large. They have been treated in separate chapters, and there is room here only to say that, while unfortunately we have almost none of Leonardo's sculpture, we have from his own great artistically critical generation traditions of magnificent accomplishment. As for Michelangelo, his own generation admired him only too much, and the almost inevitable imitation of his genius brought on decadence in plastic art much sooner than it would otherwise have come. His faults were imitated without any of the genius in power of expression that condones them in the great originals. If Michelangelo's sculpture had been the only contribution of this period to plastic art, that would have been sufficient to place it high among the periods of greatest productivity in this department of art. As it is, there were men who preceded Michelangelo whose genius is unquestioned and whose achievements have been recognized by the world ever since. The roll of sculptors of this century worthily closes with the name of John of Bologna, who was born at Douai in Flanders, but passed all his life in Italy, and it is hard to know whether to group him with the Italian or extra-Italian sculptors. Most of his great work was done after the end of our century, but as he was probably more than 25 years of age when the century closed, and received all his training and inspiration from the men of our time, he deserves a place here. John, who owes his name of Bologna to the fact that one of the greatest works, the bronze Neptune, was prepared for the fountain of Bologna, was often called by his contemporaries Il Fiammingo, in reference to the place of his birth. Probably no sculptor of his time had been more popular all down the centuries than he, and there are very few with any claim to education and culture who do not know his wonderful figure of Mercury, with winged feet borne aloft upon the breezes, blowing out of the mouth of Aeolus, the god of the winds. There has probably never been a more masterly expression of light, easy, graceful movements in statuary as this. It is for his power to express movement within the limitations of plastic art that John is famous. His Rape of the Sabines in the Bargello in Florence is declared to have come nearer to expressing swift flashing motion and airy lightness than has ever been accomplished before or since. He lacked the faults of exaggeration of the later Renaissance and had many of its best qualities. The sculptured work on and in the Certosa at Pavia belongs mainly to Columbus's period. It remains one of the great architectural and sculptural monuments of the world. It has its defects, which are mainly due to over-luxuriousness of decoration and failure to make the decoration and the structure itself harmonize, but it remains a beautiful example of the art of the time. It has continued to be ever since a place of pilgrimage for art lovers, and it will doubtless continue to be so for as long as this present phase of our civilization lasts. It contains some most effective work, and while not all of its sculpture is conceived in the true spirit of what belongs to plastic art, There is much of it that has never been surpassed except by supremely great sculptors, the men who are looked upon as the world's geniuses in this department. When the Certosa is compared with some of the churches which in the 17th and 18th centuries were thought to be the highest expression of artistic excellence, the taste and the ability of the sculptors and architects of the Renaissance become manifest. Perhaps nothing brings out in greater relief the accomplishment of the sculptors of this period than the deep decadence of the art in the succeeding century. The only name that stands out with any prominence during the 17th century is that of Bernini, a man of undoubted talent who in a better period of art might have been a sculptor of the first rank. Much of his monumental work, however, is thoroughly inartistic and has been declared, quote, a series of perfect models of what is worst in plastic art, end quote. It is still more illuminating to learn that this work was looked upon in his time with the loftiest admiration. No sculptor in any period had quite so much fulsome praise. The 18th century sank, if possible, still lower in all that pertained to true sculpture, and sculptors often of great technical skill occupied themselves in making such trivialities as statues covered with filmy veils, through which forms and features could be seen, and other tricks of art. It was not until Canova came at the end of the 18th century that there was any gleam of hope for sculpture, and even this was eclipsed to some extent by the classic formalism which came in with it. End of Chapter 6 of Book 1 of The Century of Columbus by James Joseph Walsh.